Alrighty, so I noticed that you still write for Tacky's magazine, and that's sort of like a paleo conservative outlet. I saw Ann Coulter's writes there too.
Are we recording yet, or are we? Or is this?
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
uh,
we started.
sure, no problem. Well, I mean, I've been writing for Tacky Mag for 9 years almost. It'll be 9 years in January, and
Mm.
I mean, I don't really know how much to describe Tacky Mag. Steve Saylor and Coulter, myself, used to be the home of John Derbyshire after he got sacked from National Review, and Jim Goad used to write there, Pat Buchanan as well. It's a
Mm.
collection of, well, I'll put it this way, it's one of the last places, maybe on earth, that pays writers well and does not instruct them on what they should or shouldn't write. So I'm always,
I see.
whatever I write per week is just what is haunting my mind at that particular day.
Right, it's sort of like a weekly column.
Yep, weekly column, once a week for almost 9 years, and comes out either late Monday nights, early Tuesday, depending. I mean, it's not a set thing. Tacky Mag is run very much like a newspaper. Everybody gets one day. Steve Saylor gets Wednesday. I get Tuesday. And Coulter gets
Mm.
Thursday. And so we try to do it like that. We also have a very strict word limit because a lot of times people will respond to one of my pieces by saying, well, why didn't you mention this? Why didn't you mention that? Well, each piece is not a book. We try to run it a little bit like a newspaper where there's a certain amount of column inches that you get. And we don't do the Huffington Post thing of having 5,000 word essays.
I see. I see. Yeah, I was looking at the site. It's I like it. I mean, I like a lot of the writers there. They seem to be quite right wing, paleo conservative. So that was 9 years ago. So is that when, because you kind of were disappeared for a time publicly, and then you came out and you wrote that book, Republican Party Animal. That was about 10 years ago.
Yeah, I was outed by an ex-girlfriend in April of 2013, so almost exactly, a little over a decade ago. I had I had vanished from the public scene uh, pretty much starting in '95, but much more solidly in '98 when I just decided to start working under a different name and pursue conservative politics in a more mainstream manner. So I started working with the GOP, various GOP groups in California and in Los Angeles. And then I got mixed up with a group called Friends of Abe, which was the group of Hollywood conservatives run by Clint Eastwood and Gary Sinise, Kelsey Grammer, John Voight, all of those wonderful and wacky characters. And that was my life throughout most of the early 2000s and up until 2013. I was outed in April of 2013, and then by January of 2014, I had landed this column.
All right. Yeah. So that was quite a long time ago, 10 years. Because I remember when that came out, that was definitely quite a few years back. And so you worked in Hollywood as like a party organizer for conservatives.
I was doing two things at once, roughly from like January '98 until the moment of my outing in 2013. I was really doing two things at the same time. I was working as an event organizer and planner for Friends of Abe, the Hollywood conservative group, and for my own organization called Republican Party Animals. And also, I was making mainstream Holocaust documentaries because it's a field that I know frontwards and backwards. That's what paid the bills for quite a bit in the late '90s, early 2000s, was making mainstream documentaries under the name David Stein. People still have a great deal of confusion if they haven't read my book, which you can't really because it's banned on Amazon. You can't really buy a copy. But people who haven't read my book have a great deal of confusion about the Stein last name. In '98, I just chose the last name Stein out of thin air because I wanted something that sounded Jewish and wasn't hard to pronounce or spell, because when you deal with people in Hollywood, you deal with very low IQ types who have trouble with names if they are more than a certain number of syllables. And I love the idea of Stein. And you can just say it, Stein, and bam, you're done. So, but my real name is David Cole, because you'll find idiots on Twitter who will say, "I hear his real name is Stein." My real name is David Christopher Cole, the least Jewish name you could think. However, I am 100% Jewish. It is just that my mom really liked the name Christopher and didn't worry about the religious connotations. I didn't grow up in a family of people who are superstitious about words. So David Christopher Cole is my actual legal name. Stein was just something I
So
chose when I
like
decided not to be
the
Cole anymore.
Stein thing helped you out in Hollywood because, as everyone knows, it's dominated by Jewish people, right? So
Well, Jewish people have a heavy presence, of course, and
yeah.
yeah, but I mean, it's more than that. I was doing Holocaust documentaries, and if you want to be taken seriously doing that, you would better have a Jewish-sounding name. That's just not a matter of good or bad. It's just how it is, and so hence why I chose that name to go forward with during that period.
So you're very well known for some of your videos that you made, like got to be 30 years ago now, where you're kind of walking around Auschwitz, and you were one of the very first well-known revisionist, in the sense that you were kind of questioning some of the aspects of the official story around Auschwitz, right? That was the big video. And so a lot of people kind of confused because they only saw that one video. They didn't really read your written works. They just took that video, watched that, thought that's all there is to it. So how would you describe your viewpoint in general on that topic? I guess if maybe you could explain this. Is it sort of like a semi-revisionist take, sort of like David Irving and Mark Webber now have this semi-revisionist view on the situation, that some of the things are true, some of the things are not true, there were exaggerations, but there's certain aspects of the revisionist side that aren't totally well thought out either? And that's sort of what I liked about some of your takes, is that you were in that milieu for years and years, and so you saw everything that went on. You met Forreston, you met Irving, you met Weber, and you kind of critiqued some of them as not being scholarly or not meeting a certain scholarly standard. So what were your skepticisms about the Auschwitz thing, and what is your kind of overall view of it?
Well, I'm glad you asked, and that's one of the main reasons I wanted to do this show, because I'm always happy to clear up these issues. Because my God, especially ever since Elon Musk kind of loosened the reins, and I'm not against that, but ever since he loosened the reins on Holocaust denial on Twitter, my name is everywhere, and 90% of people who invoke me don't really have much of a clue about my work. The difficulty for a lot of people, especially younger people generally have a difficulty in placing themselves in a time period that they were not in. Now, if you go back to the late 1980s, early 1990s, when I started being active in this, and again, this is something, if you're born in 1985 or 1989, you can't place yourself back in that period. But if you are me, I'm going to be 55 in another couple of weeks. If you are me, that's the period I was in. I was in my early 20s. I was 20, 21, 22. At that particular time, the Cold War had just ended officially. Soviet Union was pretty much no more. I mean, it didn't happen overnight. The wall came down East Germany. Gorbachev loosened things in Russia, and it took several years. It wasn't a light switch going on and off. But generally, the Cold War was over. There were a lot of things that could be investigated and that could be and information that could be accrued regarding the Holocaust. At that time, there was a lot of misinformation, and also a lot of the sites, the physical sites of Holocaust museums, the Majdanek Museum, that's in Poland, the Auschwitz Museum, that's also in Poland. The Mauthausen Museum, that's in Austria. Um, a lot of the sites were not well run in terms of historical accuracy. So I come on the scene, this young kid. I go to Europe multiple times. I take a lot of video, way more video than anyone had ever seen, because I would shoot everything. And I realized that a lot of these museums were portraying things inaccurately. I would speak to the museum personnel, and I would say to them, perhaps you should portray these things accurately. But nobody's going to listen to a 20-year-old, 21-year-old. I looked like a kid. Even when I was 21, I still looked like I was a teenager, in part because I'm short. I'm like 5'6". I look young, unless you're fat. Which I wasn't back then. God knows I am now, but back then I was not fat. So if you're a little guy and you're skinny, you always look like a teenager, even in your 20s. And I had my hair. If you're bald, well, of course that blows the whole deal. So nobody listened to me. So I met Mark Webber, a couple of other people who call Mark Webber's a true revisionist, and I want to say that there's never any problem with Mark Webber's scholarship. He's been one of my closest friends for 32 years, and he's a solid scholar. He just doesn't write much about history anymore. He has a public affairs podcast that he does once a week, which is wonderful, and I recommend it. But there's never been a problem with Mark Webber's scholarship. However, I did meet people at the time, a guy named Bradley Smith, of course, David Irving, Robert Forzan, whose scholarship I would end up having problems with. But I met these guys, and I made what I consider to be a very grievous error. After one of my trips to Europe, when I got an interview with the head archivist of the Auschwitz State Museum, a guy named Dr. Franciszek Pieper, and Dr. Pieper admitted to me on camera, this was not a secret shoot. It was a two-camera shoot. Two cameras, and me and my assistant set up mics and everything in his office. And he very openly said to me that the building at the Auschwitz main camp, not Birkenau, which is where the Jews were sent, but the main camp, the building at the main camp that is displayed as a gas chamber was actually a post-war reconstruction. The Soviets came in, liberated the camp, and within a couple of years following liberation, they restored in their minds it was a restoration. They restored the room to gas chamber state, but in doing so, they sullied it. They completely sullied it because they knocked down walls, they screwed around with doors, and they made a monstrosity that could obviously not have been a gas chamber. And a lot of people had, even going back to the 1970s, when people would visit Poland, even though it wasn't as easy back then during the Cold War, people would visit Poland, and you'd have revisionists back then saying, well, this doesn't look like a gas chamber, but nobody thought of just doing an interview with the guy who runs the place. And maybe me being, maybe brash because of my youth, I just thought, well, let me interview the guy. And I don't know if the fact that I'm Jewish made a difference. I don't know. He was very friendly. He gave me over an hour of his time. And I come back from that trip, one of about a dozen trips I made during that period. But I come back from that particular trip, and I've got this video of the director of archives at the museum admitting that the gas chamber was rebuilt, reconstructed. Holes were poked in the ceiling where the Soviets claim holes had once been, but there's no proof of that. And I made a terrible error. This is the error that I was alluding to a few minutes ago. The Institute for Historical Review, at that time, it was not run by Mark Webber. It was run by different people. The Institute for Historical Review says to me, why don't you do a video about it? And we'll sell it. We'll pay you. We'll give you some bucks, and you do a video about it. I didn't exactly want to do it, but being 21 years old, I think it was either 21 or 22 at the time, being that age, I kind of thought, well, it'd be nice to have money. It's always better to have a couple $1,000 than not have a couple $1,000. That's my way of looking at life. So I did a video that I thought was targeted, focused on the issue of the reconstruction of that gas chamber. And the Institute for Historical Review said, we don't like this. We don't want this. We want a hour-long video about the entire Holocaust. And I said, well, I'm not ready to opine yet on the entire Holocaust because there's a lot of information that is still coming out, a lot of information that needs to be synthesized, a lot of information that could change people's opinions about it. And so the mistake I
Mhm.
made is I gave them what they wanted. I gave them this hour-long video that is very overreaching.
So
In
that just quickly, so that video focused exclusively on the kind of main camp. Now, there's multiple parts to the camp. There's Auschwitz one, and then Birkenau, which was where they were allegedly killed, right?
Yes, but if you watch the video, the problem is it doesn't. It should have focused exclusively on the main camp. But in complying with what the Institute for Historical Review wanted, I made larger points, overarching points about the Holocaust in general. I didn't deny it. There's nothing in the video that denies the Holocaust. It's just I made a video. It was uh, very warm in LA. I remember when I did it in one day. I thought I half-assed the thing, but by God, that was October 1992, and people still share that damn thing to this day. All over Twitter, all over BitChute, all over Rumble. If I had known, if I'd had the foresight, which I did not have, if I had the foresight to know that that damned video would still be alive and kicking and defining me 32 years later, of course I would not have done it. Sure, I wanted a couple grand, but not at the expense of the rest of my damned life. I prize my life a lot more
So
than 2 grand.
So that video is quite convincing to a lot of people, where you go into that room and you show that they knocked down walls and there weren't really holes. They there weren't actually holes in the roof. They did that later, and you were asking the kind of person that was showing you around questions, and they passed it off as a real actual gas chamber, right?
That was
And
the
so
problem I was
you
addressing. I was addressing the problem that these museums, and
but it,
I made that same point when I did the Phil Donahue show in January 1994, where I showed video of other um, so-called gas chamber rooms at other museums that obviously had been either reconstructed or rebuilt because they couldn't be gas chambers in that particular form. That was what I
right.
was trying to address was the uh, that at that time, late 80s, early 90s, these museums were not being honest in their representation, and they were relying on things that went back to the immediate post-war period when propaganda was being manufactured by the victorious allies.
Do you think that the reason they did this, which I think this is kind of probable, is that they didn't actually have a gas chamber to show anybody, because the ones over in the alleged ones in the other part of the camp were destroyed or partially destroyed, right? And so they had to
Well,
show the tourists something, so they just kind of created this kind of fake gas chamber. But do you actually believe that was used as a gas chamber at some point, or was that completely just a different room
well,
entirely?
Crema 1, the room that was reconstructed after the war, nobody can say with metaphysical certitude if somebody wasn't killed in there. You can't say that. You can't prove that kind of a negative. What you can say, what I will say, is that for that particular room at the main camp, there exists no convincing evidence beyond the testimony of the commandant, whose testimony is very unreliable. And I'm not the only one who has said that. Deborah Lipstadt has said that some of the uh, biggest names in Holocaust historiography have said that. However, at Birkenau, the Jewish camp, there were rooms that definitely were used for gassing, and a couple of rooms that might have been. The ones that were definitely used for gassing in 1942, sometimes they're called the farmhouses, the cottages. They were erased. There was nothing for me to examine or for anyone to examine in the late 80s, early 90s. As far as the bigger rooms at Birkenau, called Crema 2, Crema 3, again, you can't prove a negative in that context. We do have evidence that the cottages had been used for gassing in 1942 during the typhus epidemic. Now, Rudolf Hirsch, the commandant of that camp, the man who would eventually be relieved of duty, nearly prosecuted by the SS for misdeeds in the camp, but he was brought back in 1944 to handle the Hungarian transports. It is entirely plausible that Rudolf Hirsch might have gone back to his ways of killing inmates. We have multiple questions that are open. The extent to which any gassings happened after
So
1942, and
what,
the
what
extent to which Hirsch was acting on his own or acting on orders from Berlin. But before you say anything else, I do also want to say, putting Auschwitz aside, and those open questions aside, and the closed questions. I mean, there really were 100%. There were gassings at those cottages in 1942. We have the testimony of the camp doctor Kramer, and he survived the war. So it's not a thing where we found a scrap of paper and was saying, "Oh, I bet this means there was gassings." No, he wrote a diary. He testified about the diary. He survived the war. Nobody tortured him. Nobody threatened him. There were absolutely gassings in those cottages in 1942. But putting Auschwitz aside, the main extermination program did not involve Auschwitz. The main extermination program involved what are known as the Reinhard camps, Sobibor, Treblinka, Belzec, and those camps were completely razed by the Nazis in 1943. I mean, they were erased from the earth. Treblinka was, when it ceased functioning, was erased from the earth, planted over. Everything about it. And we have Allied aerial photographs showing that entire process of how Treblinka was erased. So you are correct in what you said a few minutes ago. The war was over, and there was a large number of missing Jews, Jewish population that was no longer, primarily Polish Jews and Russian Jews, but the Polish Jews primarily bore the brunt of Nazi wrath. And the actual extermination camps like Treblinka did not exist in any physical state any longer. The bodies had been burned and the buildings had been plowed under, and a nice pastoral field had been planted. That alone is, of course, very interesting. The fact that these are the only examples where the Nazis did that. I mean, there are examples of Nazis destroying things, so the invading Soviets, the re-invading, the reconquering Soviets could not get access to them. But the idea of erasing a camp entirely so that nobody even knew it was there, that was unique. As was the fact that Treblinka and Sobibor saw mass revolts, the skeleton crew of Jews who had worked there during the extermination period, because those Jews understood en masse that they would
okay?
not be allowed
Before
to
we
survive.
before we get to the other
Sure.
camps, I wanted to go back to Auschwitz.
Sure.
So that room they show is not real; it's a reconstruction. So people kind of take that video that you made and they think like there's nothing else to the story. So there's also, the swimming pool, and there was the they had an orchestra and they had a soccer field. So the critique you made of like the mainstream historians is that they tried to kind of deny that those things were in the camp. And the reason they tried to deny those things were in the camp or downplay them was because it didn't really fit with the picture that they wanted, that it was just purely a camp of extermination and wasn't for labor at all or something like that. So there were kind of distortions on the mainstream side to paint a picture that they wanted to, and those things didn't fit that picture. So they initially denied there was a pool and denied there was anything. But what was that pool actually used for? Was it for the inmates? Like what's your research on that?
Well, this is an important point, because before I go into it, it's important for your listeners to understand. We're dealing with bad faith actors on both sides. On one side, on the mainstream side, you have people, and I tackled this in a column on TachiMag just 3 weeks ago. You have people on the mainstream side whose first impulse is to lie. even if they don't have to, even if the truth is on their side. They think so little of the general public, and they see themselves as people who must manipulate the point of view of the general public. That their first instinct is always to engage in untruth. And on the other side, you have the outright deniers. They are also bad faith actors because they have long abandoned any search for the truth, because if anything pops up that does not agree with their bias, with their ideology, they dismiss it. So
Right.
to get to the specifics of what you said, yes, there was a swimming pool, not a water aqueduct, not a repository for fire hoses. There was an actual swimming pool at the Auschwitz main camp. It's important to understand the difference between the Auschwitz main camp and Auschwitz-Birkenau, which was a couple of kilometers away. The main camp was a penal institution. It was for prisoners. It was for people, uh, Polish resistance fighters, petty criminals in some cases, but it was like any other prison. It was not the Jewish part of Auschwitz. And like any prison on earth, where the inmates are always going to outnumber the guards, any prison in the US, that's going to be the case. Um, Prisoners could get perks for good behavior. And so, yes, there was a swimming pool. It was sometimes used by the SS, but oftentimes it was used by prisoners who had earned the privilege by good behavior. Again, the same way in any U.S. prison, if you behave yourself, you get chocolate bars, you get more time on the yard, maybe you get a conjugal visit. This is how prisons work and always have worked. Um, so there
Yeah.
was a swimming pool. Same thing at the main camp. There was a theater.
Mm.
Prisoners could see plays, could see shows. Again, if they earned the privilege. Once again, in a U.S. prison, there's movie night, but you don't get to go to movie night if you've acted up and caused disciplinary problems. This
This
is
is
how prisons
where
are run.
the skeptics will come in and say, that wouldn't even exist in an extermination camp. So if like the official story was saying, oh, it was a pure extermination camp, that can't be totally true, because there was labor going on, and you do need to take care of the laborers to some degree, and you do need to give them some amenities to keep them obedient and keep them working for you. So the claim that it was a pure extermination camp is not true, right?
Well, first of all, nobody ever claims the main camp was an extermination camp. They claim that Birkenau, several kilometers away, was the extermination facility.
Okay.
But to whatever extent people Jews, and some gypsies, but mainly Jews, were killed at Birkenau, it was also very clearly a labor and internment camp. One of the problems we get in this field, Brandon, is certain documents that are very important in understanding the history are rejected by both extremes because they don't agree with both extremes. And now the example I will give you is there's a speech that Himmler gave, actually a series of speeches, sometimes just referred in general as the Sonthofen speeches. But there's a speech that Himmler gave to SS generals, SS higher ups, where he kind of says two things at once. Now, I'm paraphrasing, of course, for the sake of your listeners, but the speech is quite easy. These speeches are quite easy to find. In fact, even in revisionist materials, there nobody denies the reality, the accuracy, the truthfulness of these speeches. Himmler says, uh, uh, on the one hand, he says, yes, we killed the Polish Jews and even the kids. And people say to me, why did you have to kill the children? And well, I say to them, if we kill the parents and we don't kill the children, well, those children are going to grow up and they're going to want vengeance. And all we would be doing by not killing the children is inflicting this problem, just kicking the can down the road so that our children and our grandchildren will have to deal with it. So we killed the kids, as bad as that was. We killed the kids for the sake of
Is that
our descendants. But in that same speech, also says, now, I know that you didn't like killing all those Polish Jews. He's talking to his SS generals there. I know you didn't like doing that. Nobody, no man likes doing that. No man wants to kill a kid. You did it, and you held your fudge, and good on you. And now the bad news, because the war is turned against us, we've got to bring in 100,000 and a couple 100,000 laborers, Jewish laborers from Hungary. We got to bring them back into the Reich. You did a great job clearing out those Polish Jews, and I'm glad you did. But unfortunately, we now got to bring Jews back in purely for labor. Don't worry, they're going to be in labor camps, and they won't mix with the general population. But we need the labor. Now, you see
Is
what I'm
that
saying right there. The
is that
same,
speech in 1943? Is that the Poznan speech?
this is different than Poznan. Poznan was the one that historians cite, and this is the point I'm making. The reason mainstream historians cite Posen instead of Sonthofen, and the reason deniers don't cite Sonthofen, even though it makes it clear that the 1944 Hungarian transports were for labor, not extermination, is that because this series of speeches affirms two things. It affirms that the Polish Jews were killed. It also affirms that the Hungarian Jews were being brought in for labor, not to be killed, but for labor. Now, the mainstream doesn't want to cite that speech because the mainstream, they're fine with the part of it that says, yeah, the Polish Jews were killed, but they don't want anyone to think that the Hungarian Jews are being brought in for labor. They want you to think the
Mm.
Hungarian Jews are being brought in to be exterminated. The deniers, on the other hand, they're fine with the part that says, yeah, the Hungarian Jews are being brought in for labor. Cool. That totally bolsters our side. Oh, but he also says the Polish Jews were killed, and we can't allow that because our claim is
Mm.
that it was only a couple 100,000 Jews from
So
Typhus at the end of the
so
war.
they're
So
both
it's a
cherry
document
picking.
it's
They're
a
both
document
cherry picking
neither
out.
side will claim. That's what you get in a lot of Holocaust historiography these days, is that you get documents that neither side will claim because it
Right.
doesn't agree 100% with this extreme or that extreme.
Right. The I noticed that this was happening, that any evidence, so the revisionist side will dismiss any evidence of mass murder, and it's not just Jews. There's evidence that Himmler and Rosenberg, they talk about, and even Goebbels, they talk about, basically moving Slavs off of their land. I've been covering this recently, and you see the denials. You can use explicit, uh, speeches that where they're talking about, transporting Slavs off of their land, colonizing Ukraine for German settlement. You can even bring up like Hitler in Mein Kampf saying that his goal in chapter 13, he says, the 1914 borders aren't sufficient for German living space. We're not going back to the 1914 borders. We're going to expand into Russia and its borderlands. And you cite that, and they just go into denial mode or tell you the translation's wrong or something, because they're promoting a mythology that Hitler just wanted to take back a tiny little chunk of Poland and the Sudetenland, which is not true at all. It's totally, by his own words, by his own admission, that wasn't the goal whatsoever. It was to expand. And so they just dismiss any evidence to the contrary. And in a speech, Himmler actually says that they're going to use Slavs as slaves. He says that in the Poznan speech. And Rosenberg confirmed that at Nuremberg. But what they say about Nuremberg is they say, oh, you can't trust anything from Nuremberg because they were all tortured or something. What's the response to that? Like, they're all tortured, so you can't believe it?
Okay, I want to make a larger point with this, if you'll give me a few minutes here, because this ties in with my error with the video I did in 1992. It's really important for people who are interested in this topic, or really interested in any post-war historiography, Civil War, the Pacific theater during World War II. It's very important for people to understand that the immediate post-war period, which you can call the pacification period, the victors have won, but they have a population they now have to pacify. The pacification period is part of the war. So people see Nuremberg as some attempt at constructing a history, but no, Nuremberg was simply part of the war. It was not trustworthy. It was not something that nobody bases, no serious historian bases their historiography on Nuremberg testimony. Same thing with the Soviets knocking down the walls in that chamber. That was part of the immediate post-war propaganda. That is part of the war. Now, once the war is over, when I say over, I mean also the pacification period is over. The first great Holocaust book to come out was 1953, a book called The Final Solution by an author named Gerald Reitlinger. This is about the time real historians step in. The whole 1940s, especially 45 and 46, 47, it's still the war. I mean, the war might be over in terms of people shooting at each other, but the pacification period is still going on. You don't trust things from there. But it's also something that people have to be okay with. You have to understand, okay, we don't trust things from post-war. And again, that's my mistake in that 1992 video. I made it seem like the Soviets knocking down walls and redoing that gas chamber was part of some kind of never seen before conspiracy, but no, it is just part of what happens in the pacification period when a war is over. Now you get to the 1950s, everything's cooled down. Everyone's passive. The populations that need to be pacified are pacified, and the world has kind of moved on. Korean War, other things. Now is when historians come in. And I should have made that much clearer in the video that I did regarding Nuremberg. Yeah, I would never base a thesis on Nuremberg testimony. You base your thesis on contemporaneous documents. You base your thesis on things that the people who were doing this stuff wrote amongst themselves during the war. And I do want to add this point that by 1994, because I made that Auschwitz video in 92, in 94, one of the more important things in revisionist history happened. David Irving went to Moscow in order to confirm the Goebbels diary. The Goebbels diary had been kind of broken up into two. There was the handwritten notes that fell into American hands after the war, and then there were the microfiche plates, because Goebbels had his diaries memorialized for all time on microfiche, and those were in the Russian hands. And Goebbels went to Moscow, and he authenticated the Goebbels diaries. Now, Irving made this announcement in September 1994. I was there. He and I were speaking at a conference together. Once Irving authenticated the Goebbels diaries, and Irving has certain skills, and I don't. Irving is quite skilled at authenticating signatures, authenticating handwriting, because Irving has spent his entire life examining every personal detail, from the handwriting to the toothbrushes of Third Reich people. That's his thing, and he does it well. He's made other mistakes as a historian, but he does that particular thing very well. Once Irving had authenticated the Goebbels diaries, for me, I realized the stuff that Goebbels talks about regarding the extermination of the Polish Jews, well, that's got to be the next focus. That's got to be the thing revisionists have to, number one, admit, concede that happened. Because once you've authenticated the Goebbels diaries, everything else that Himmler and Stroop and Korer and Kuba, all of these Nazis who also talked about that period, about the extermination of the Polish Jews. And when I say extermination, generally it was 60% of the Polish Jews who were exterminated, 40% could be used for labor, about 60% were killed. The funny thing about that, going back to September 94, I came to that conclusion before Irving did, and Irving was the one who authenticated the damn document. But at that point, is when I started to realize we got to get off this obsession with gas chamber door locks and opens in, opens out, because, Brandon, I want to make this point. That work I did in the early 90s paid off. Auschwitz no longer says that that room is in its original state. The Mauthausen Museum no longer says that that room is in its original state and that those doors are real gas chamber doors. The Majdanek Museum has erased several gas chambers from its tour and said these were not gas chamber rooms. That work paid off. Move on
They
now.
admitted that.
Sorry?
They admitted that they misrepresented some of the rooms.
Yes, yeah, as I said, the work I did in the early 90s paid off, but then instead of whereas there are people, Lord knows you see them on Twitter, there are people who would like me to just rest on those laurels and do nothing but talk about that for the rest of my damned life. That is not what I wanted to do. Once those battles had been won, you have to move on to the bigger question. And once Irving authenticated the Goebbels diary, the bigger question became, okay, now we have to look at what's called the Action Reinhard camps, the camps that dealt with the extermination of the Polish Jews. And then you have to also start to understand what's the relationship between Action Reinhard, which concluded more or less at the end of
So
1942, but continued a bit into 1943, and the relationship between Action Reinhard and Auschwitz.
So David Irving he more or less has the same view as you that the killings took place in the East. Mark Weber also says that. So those are guys who have been called revisionists, have been called deniers. David Irving went to jail for allegedly denial, but they accused him of denial because he basically said what you said about that one room in the main camp of Auschwitz not being a gas chamber. And they used that to say he was a total denier, but he wasn't a total denier. He was just refuting that specific thing. Now they claim that wasn't the main gas chamber at Auschwitz. They claim it was at Birkenau. Now the Goebbels diary that you're talking about, I'm going to put this on the screen here. This is it right here. The passage that you're talking about says, beginning with Lublin, the Jews of the general government are being evacuated eastward. The procedure is a pretty barbaric one, not described here more definitely. Not much will remain of the Jews. On the whole, it can be said about 60% of them will be liquidated, whereas only about 40% can be used for forced labor. And then it says, the Gauleiter of Vienna, who is to carry this measure through, is doing it with considerable circumspection, according to a method that does not attract too much attention. A judgment is to be visited upon the Jews that, while barbaric is fully deserved by them, the prophecy which the Führer made about having brought on the New World War is beginning to come true in the most terrible manner. One of the most sentimental in these, we must not be sentimental in these matters. If we did not fight the Jews, they would destroy us. It's a life and death struggle between the Aryan race and the Jewish bacillus. No other government and no other regime would have the strength for such a global solution to this question. Here, too, the Führer is the undismayed champion of the radical solution necessitated by conditions and therefore inexorable. Fortunately, a whole series of possibilities presents itself for us in wartime. And then it says the ghettos will be emptied and the general government will now be refilled with Jews thrown out of the Reich. This process is to be repeated. There's nothing funny in it for the Jews, and the fact that Jewish representatives in England and America are today organizing and sponsoring the war against Germany must be paid for it dearly by their representatives in Europe. So I've been reading the Goebbels diaries, and if you're a revisionist, right? If you're truly looking for the truth of this matter, you cannot deny stuff like this. If you're to even doubt many aspects of the camps or whatever, this is a pretty clear statement about those Eastern Jews, or the push, the decision to send them east. Now, Germar Rudolph and others, I don't know how much work they've done in this, but they don't really have an answer, is what you would say. They don't have an answer for what happened to the Jews that were sent to the east, to the camps. I have a few questions about Treblinka for you, by the way, but you saying this is authentic diary, right? And this is a statement pretty clearly that there were some killings going on. He doesn't say the method. However, he does say it was happening. So as a revisionist, you cannot just ignore any piece of evidence that's contrary to your view. You have to go where the evidence shows. So this seems to be one of the pieces of evidence that confirms that view, right? Is there
Well,
anything
yeah,
else?
couple things. I want to go back to something you said at the beginning regarding the main camp gas chamber at Auschwitz, where you said now they say it was at Birkenau. They always said the gassings were at Birkenau. The main camp gas chamber was always a minor gas chamber. It's just the problem was the gas chambers at Birkenau, 4 of them were completely erased. 2 of them were dynamited in. They did not offer any like visual pluses for tour groups. But I don't want people to think that because of my work debunking or possibly debunking the main camp gas chamber. That meant that they shifted to other gas chambers. The Birkenau gas chambers were always, going back to the 40s, always the main ones. It's just that it was the main camp gas chamber that was used for tourists. Secondly,
Right.
I
Revisionists dispute the other chambers as well, right?
they do. They do. And those are the open questions I talked about earlier about, we're dealing with things that, to what extent, if they were they used? We do know that the farmhouses, which were erased, the farmhouses were certainly used. And to what extent Crema 2, Crema 3 were used, it's not possible to say they were never used. From that, I want to jump to something else you said regarding David Irving and Mark Weber. Irving is a hard man to pin down. I've known the guy 33 years. He will say different things based on a different audience. And that's why when he authenticated the Goebbels diary, I kind of took it more seriously than he did, because Irving tends to give speeches based on who he's talking to. But I understand that because I don't necessarily approve of it, but I understand it based on the fact that he sells books for a living. I don't. I can say this. I can anger any side. I can anger the mainstream historians and I can anger the deniers, and it does not affect my income. So perhaps I can be a little more honest and straightforward that way. Now, getting to your question, it's very important to understand the Goebbels diary does not exist alone. One of the things that deniers will say is, oh, one document, that's all you have, but that's simply not true. The Goebbels diary agrees with the Kohrer report, and that was the report by Himmler's statistician that was commissioned in 42 and finally delivered in early 43, and that roughly shows about 60% of Polish Jews were indeed killed. So the Kohrer report agrees with the Goebbels diary. The General Stroop, who fought the battle on the German side against the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, General Stroop says quite clearly, I am sending Jews to Treblinka to be killed. The only denier answer to that is, and it's very funny, unintentionally funny, deniers say, well, they just randomly picked a name, Treblinka. It doesn't mean Treblinka was a place where Jews were killed. He could have said Cleveland. He could have said Poughkeepsie. And they don't have an answer for that. So you have Goebbels, you have Kohrer, you have Stroop, you have Himmler, the Sonthofen speeches talking about the liquidation of Polish Jews. You have Kuba, General Commissar in Belarus, who talks about the liquidation of the Russian Jews there, and then of the German Jews that were sent into the Minsk ghetto. All of the documents agree with each other. There's no anomaly. Now, the best the deniers can do, and this is really what it all comes down to, Brandon, the entire debate can be synthesized to this. Because I like to start with, what do both sides agree on? When you begin there, what are the mainstream and the deniers / revisionists, what do we all agree on? So we begin with that. What we all agree on is, because everybody agrees, the Kohrer report, that Himmler's statistician report, everyone agrees that's a legit document. Nobody claims it was forged. Nobody claims that it's a Soviet invention. So we all start there, and we know that Kohrer states that 2.4 million Jews were, quote unquote, evacuated by the beginning of 1943, and the majority of those evacuations happened in 1942. We all kind of agree on that. So the question becomes, what happened to those 2.4 million Jews, quote unquote, evacuated in 1942? Well, Kohrer kind of gives it away. He describes them as Abgang, which kind of means dispatched, done away with. But he also then describes them as Todesfallen, dead. That is a word that only has that meaning. It doesn't have a double meaning. And no, it doesn't mean knock 'em dead like stand-up comedy. It doesn't mean that the Jews were sent to a comedy show and were knocked dead with humor. Todesfallen basically means the dead, a list of the dead. Now, the denier position on that, they agree that these 2.4 million Jews were evacuated, they claim that they were sent to a resettlement village. Now, for perspective, Brandon, 2.4 million people, that's the population of Houston. So the denier position is that the entire population of Houston was sent to a village near the front, and nobody saw it, nobody wrote about it, nobody ever said a word about it. The Nazis didn't say anything, the Soviets didn't say anything, the spies on all sides didn't say anything, the Jews never said anything. That's what's funny about it, because these 2.4 million Jews that were, if deniers are correct, these 2.4 million Jews were in fact sent to an idyllic little town by the front. Okay, even if you want to believe that no one saw it, that the Nazis could pull this off so that nobody on Earth, even the aerial reconnaissance photos, that nobody saw it, you want to believe that, you have another hurdle, which is that in the early 1950s, when West Germany signed the reparations bill that gave money to anyone who was sent to any kind of camp, any Jew sent to any kind of camp or ghetto, any Jew who was taken from their home for any reason would get a big fat check. You're supposed to believe, according to deniers, that 2.4 million Jews were taken from their homes to this idyllic town and kept there till the end of the war. But then, when the reparations deal was signed, they decided to not apply for checks. 2.4 million Jews decided, you know what, we want to pretend we didn't exist, so that nobody knows about that idyllic little town. So not one of us is going to apply for a reparations check. Now that's just silly. And even people who are hardcore Jew haters are going to have a lot of trouble explaining or defending the notion that 2.4 million Jews all have checks dangling in front of them that they could take by simply admitting they existed and that they were transferred to this resettlement ghetto, resettlement town, and not one of them takes it. That's very, improbable.
There were Jews who took those reparations who turned out that they weren't actually in some of the camps. Like there were some frauds. There were some people who lied and said they were there but weren't there, had already moved out. So there's definitely, like, there's a guy called Norman Finkelstein. He wrote that book, The Holocaust Industry, where he exposed some of these frauds, some of these people who lied just to get some of the money that was being doled out by the German state. Now, you're saying that there would have been more people claiming that money if 2.4 million of these people were actually alive and so forth. Now, the claim is that they're sent to the east, to these camps, the Reinhard camps, or further east. Because the Reinhard camps were in eastern Poland, right?
Yeah, well, the Reinhard camps were very small, so nobody claims that 2.4 million Jews were housed there. The denier claim is that the Jews were sent to the Reinhard camps and then sent on, that these Reinhard camps were transit camps, and they were sent on to some unnamed idyllic location for resettlement.
Okay, so Treblinka. So there's a guy called Eric Hunt, and he was a pretty prominent revisionist. He made multiple documentaries questioning, similar to your documentaries. He goes through the camps and he goes to the different rooms and so on. Now, he did a thing in Treblinka because not a lot of people have looked at that camp. Now, he showed in his documentary that the official historians like Yitzhak Arad, and he sent an email to this guy and he's like, did anybody survive Treblinka? And Yitzhak Arad said, no, nobody survived. Everybody was immediately gassed. Now, Hunt later dug up some testimonies from Holocaust survivors, and some of them actually said that they went to Treblinka and they're alive. So the official historians claim that they were all immediately killed there is not accurate, because some of them did go through that camp and were sent to other camps, I guess, for labor, and did survive. So what? How do they square this? So there seems to be some proof on the revisionist side for Treblinka that it wasn't a pure extermination camp, if some Jews themselves say it wasn't, right?
Well, happy to address that. Number one, Eric Hunt uh,
He later
has,
recanted by most of his stuff, by the way,
but
but yeah,
it's
that
important.
sounds.
He recanted his views, but it's important to understand why. Because whereas I was targeted in 1997, 98, I was targeted by a violent extremist group called the Jewish Defense League that actually threatened to murder me. Eric Hunt, there is a lot of dense history there. Hunt and I had a bunch of back and forths, a lot of times through an intermediary, because I didn't really like talking to the guy since he was a convicted felon, and I didn't think much of him. But Hunt recanted for one main reason, and he states this quite clearly in his recantation. And I wouldn't even necessarily call it a recantation because that brings up images of Galileo. I think it's more that he simply changed his point of view, which everybody has the right to do. And it plays into what you're asking about Treblinka survivors. What Hunt realized is that there were no cases of Treblinka Jews being sent elsewhere. Among the targeted population of Polish Jews in 1942, you can find cases of Treblinka, a couple of cases where it can be argued that Treblinka was used as a way station for Jews of other nationalities in 1943, when technically Action Reinhardt was over. Although Action Reinhardt was not, again, it's not a light switch where it's on and it's off. It petered out. But what Hunt realized, and again, he says this quite clearly in his statement of why he's no longer a denier, what you can't find are any of those 60% Polish Jews that Goebbels talks about right there in that diary entry. Not a one of them can be proven to have survived. It is fully possible that once Reinhardt was over and the Jewish population of Poland was thinned to where the Nazis wanted it to be thinned, that some Jews did come in and out of Treblinka as a way station. Completely possible. And one of the things that I point out in my book is that at the end of Reinhardt, Himmler and the other Nazis begin talking about the final solution to the Jewish question in past tense. That's very important because these are government functionaries. So when they talk about something in the past tense as being over, and that's part of my thesis, is that with the conclusion of Reinhardt, that was pretty much the conclusion of the killing phase. Treblinka still existed for much of 1943. And yeah, Dutch Jews, some French Jews, it's completely possible that some Jews came down that rail line to other places. But in terms of that targeted population in 1942, that 60% of Polish Jewry that was sent to those Reinhardt camps, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Hunt couldn't find a single case of any of them surviving. And that's part of what led to him renouncing his views, because that would have been, that's it's very powerful when you realize that you have that many people, 2.4 million Jews in total of evacuees, but roughly about 1.2.5
All right.
million Polish Jews. Yeah.
So you're saying that it was just the Polish ones that were targeted, and they didn't treat the other Jews of different nationalities in the same way. They kind of were a bit softer on them, or didn't exterminate them in the same way.
Oh, we know this for a fact. This is nothing to guess about. I mentioned earlier Wilhelm Kuba, the General Commissar of Belarus, who oversaw, among other things, the Minsk ghetto. Well, Kuba was very chatty. He's a real chatty guy. And again, these are documents nobody denies the accuracy of. Germar Rudolph doesn't, Jürgen Graf, all of the current remaining deniers don't challenge the authenticity of this. And Kuba makes a very big deal to Heydrich, his superior in Berlin, Kuba is like, okay, I killed all the Russian Jews in Belarus, and it had to be done, and it was good that it was done because these people are slime. These people are the genetic detritus. We got to get rid of them. But you're sending me German and Austrian Jews into this ghetto, and you're asking me to kill them. Oh my God, they look like me. They look like us. They know the same music. They know the same arts. They know the same culture. We have the same shared cultural milieu. I don't want to kill these guys. Now, this is all very well documented. So you have Kuba as an example, a man who oversaw hundreds of thousands of Jews being killed and talks about it. You have him saying, I'm fine with killing this group of Slavic, filthy Bolshevik Jews, but this guy's got blonde hair, this guy's got blue eyes, this guy's got green eyes. These are like us. That was
But
not.
can't Slavic? I mean, Slavic people. I would assume some Slavic Jews would also have blonde hair and blue eyes in some cases, right?
Yeah, but you're ignoring the amount of impetus that the Nazis put on DNA if you were Slavic. And there were
Yeah,
many cases, of Slavs, Jewish or not, who were Germanized because they looked so Aryan. That did happen. But generally
right.
speaking, Russian Jews were seen as worthy of immediate death. Polish Jews could be kind of divided into those who could labor, those who couldn't, but German and Austrian Jews were seen as part of the culture. And that's why when Kuba complains to Heydrich responds, and Heydrich says, "Man, you are dogging me on the ass about this thing. Uh, if there are any of these if any of these German or Austrian Jews who deserve to be sent to Theresienstadt, which was like the comfortable ghetto for privileged Jews," Heydrich says, "I'll do it. But you know what? I don't have time for this."
So
And in
so
the end,
there's no.
I don't want to
Yeah,
say,
go
in
ahead.
the end, Kuba did end up liquidating the non-laboring German and Austrian Jews. He didn't want to. He bitched about it. He complained about it. But the in the end, he did, because once the war stalled. This is again talking about my thesis here, not necessarily shared by the mainstream or by deniers, but the German and Austrian Jews were initially supposed to be sent to Minsk, sent to the east. And then when the Germans won the war, they were not necessarily supposed to be killed. But once the war turned against the Germans got real antsy that they had all of these high IQ German and Austrian Jews back close to the front. And Kuba was instructed to kill them, and he did. But it is very important to note, when he wrote to Heydrich saying, "I don't want to kill him, I don't want to do this," and he wrote to Losa, not just Heydrich, but his other immediate superior, Losa, and he says, "I don't want to do this." That shows that in the Nazi mindset, there was always a kind of sentimentality that was attached to certain types of Jews, and a kind of very barbarous
Well,
hatred that was attached to others.
there was no doubt that Hitler and the top brass hated the Slavic people, not Jews, but Slavs, like
Yeah,
legit Gentile
absolutely.
Slavs. I mean, Hitler says in Mein Kampf that they're an inferior race and we have the right to rule them, and that's what Lebensraum was all about, was ruling the Slavs and taking land for German resettlement and expansion, which they did in Ukraine. They actually built some settlements for Germans and moved them in and moved the Slavs out and used some of the Ukrainians as slave labor. So this is undisputed that they hated the Slavs and said that they were inferiors so that they could justify taking their land. That's 100% backed up by Hitler's own statements in Mein Kampf and elsewhere. Rosenberg and Himmler, actually, Himmler in a speech says that we're going to use them as slaves. I have the quote here, but the Treblinka thing. So I guess some of the questions with the revisionists and skeptics would bring up would be like, oh, well, what about like Eli Wiesel saying he was treated for his infection and then he was marched back to the West? Why would that happen if they just wanted to liquidate them all? And then the issue with Treblinka, I guess, that revisionists bring up is that the methods that they used allegedly was, a diesel. I guess they're claiming it was like a diesel engine in some revision. Even Eric Hunt brought up in one of his videos. He says that the diesel is not that poisonous. You can't really just kill millions of people with that. It's quite a safe a gas. It's not like riddled with carbon monoxide and so on. So the killing method in Treblinka, according to the official story, was what?
Well, the killing method at Treblinka and Sobibor was by exhaust. Now, some people have said diesel, others have said basic carbon monoxide. It is certainly true that if you lock people in a room, an unventilated room, carbon monoxide will put them to sleep. I mean, that is absolutely true. We see that happen accidentally hundreds of times a year. So,
But diesel, though, which is a
yeah,
bit different.
it's important to not get hung up on what there have been survivors who have said diesel. I don't go by survivor testimony. It's supplementary, but primary documents by Nazis themselves always have to be the primary sources. What revisionists and deniers will do is they will seize on something that a survivor says that is quite obviously unlikely, improbable, and probably not true. But we can't go by that to make the history. We also can't go by debunking it to make the history, because these people, whatever they went through, and many of them were very young and went through incredibly horrendous things in their youth. You don't build a historiography based on those eyewitness testimonies, and that is one of the problems that the mainstream has itself created, because the mainstream Holocaust scholars have focused so much on deniers, saying, well, the deniers prove it, the deniers prove it. They don't. It's the contemporaneous documents that prove it. But because the mainstream, which is always looking for the shortcut, for the easy way out, and the easy way out for them is to trot out an elderly Jew who says, oi, and then this happened to me, and that happened to me, oi. That's a shortcut, but it's exactly what furthers denial, because when you derail the conversation from contemporaneous Nazi documents and you bring in old Jews who maybe that works with kids. You have a 10-year-old, 12-year-old kid goes to the Museum of Tolerance and sees an old Jew and everyone's weeping. Well, maybe that works, but that's not how history, a solid history, not how that's created.
The testimony from some of these less than credible witnesses, like Irene Zisblatt, like they're exaggerating their story, saying she was like inside of a chamber and escaped the chamber and pooped out diamonds. Like there's certain outrageous testimonies that are clearly not true and false, and they're just like embellished to create sensationalism in order to sell. I mean, there must be a monetary motivation for some Jews to like sensationalize the testimony, create these effects, these kind of hysterical effects and notes to make it.
Let me interrupt you there. I would not say monetary. I would say that if anyone is put through something very traumatic, very violent by anyone, and that can be anything. That can be Jews in the Holocaust. That can be kulaks during Stalin's reign. That can be a woman beaten by her husband who now is testifying in a child custody case. You are always going to exaggerate the evil that was done to you. That's human nature. That is emotion.
Yeah, but there are cases that were exposed, like the I forget his name, but he was on Oprah. He wrote this book about his experience in the camp. Like he said that this met his wife through the barbed wire, and she threw him an apple, and it turned out that was a complete lie, and he made up that story. He was in the camp, but he made up the.
But now you're redirecting the discussion away from survivors towards outright fraudsters. I will point out there have been many polls and studies that show, for example, how many Vietnam War vets claim to have saw action who actually spent the entire war without actually being involved in a single firefight. So you have that, but then you also have people who were never in the war who claimed to be Vietnam. I met with one of the guys during my Republican Party animal days was a guy, I'm blanking on his name, and I wish I could remember, but he's a guy who claimed to have been this war hero. Turned out he had not been in any war. So you have to look at the different degrees of this. You have survivors who exaggerate. Then you have people, and not I mean, there's dozens of stories, but dozens of stories is not a big deal when you're dealing with something that dealt with 10 million people. But you have dozens of people who weren't even there. There was the woman who claimed she was raised by wolves, the Jewish woman who claimed that she escaped the Nazis and raised by wolves. That she did. I think she didn't even turn out to be Jewish.
Yeah, she was not Jewish, that one.
Yeah. So you have these outright
but that's it. That's a monetary motivation, even in that case, right?
That's the monetary motivation. But what I'm talking about is the people who really were in a camp, who really were dragged from their homes and had everything they owned taken from them, and in many cases lost relatives.
Well, here's an argument. I mean, so I guess from the revisionist side, they will seize on those fake testimonies, those exaggerated, those liars, to say that like all of the testimony is false. But that's not even the case, because you saw in Eric Hunt's documentary, he's using testimonies from Jews to make his case, right? Like the ones from Treblinka or the ones who were doing leisure activities in Auschwitz, they use those testimonies. So revisionists are not going to they will use testimonies, right, if it fits their narrative, right. But they will dismiss the testimonies that they'll dismiss all testimonies as if they're all the same, but they're not, right? I mean, there's ones that are accurate and there's ones that are not, right?
That's very true. And that's why what I try to stress to people is you have to look at building a solid historiography as kind of a pyramid. The bottom stones, the solid stones at the bottom, that has to be contemporaneous documents. Now, on top of that, you can put smaller stones that deal with the testimony of survivors, the testimony of some of, like, for example, a couple of the commandants of the Reinhard camp survived. All of the men who had been at some point or another either a commandant or a higher up at a Reinhard camp all told the same story, that it was an extermination camp, but that was irrelevant of their position. Some of these guys were prosecuted, some of them weren't. Some of them were in prison, some of them were free. Some of them had served their time and then been released. Some of them were recorded above board, some of them were recorded surreptitiously. They all told the same story, and nobody who served at Treblinka on the Nazi side ever said, oh no, it was just a simple transit camp. But again, those testimonies, whether they're accurate or not, cannot be the foundation. The foundation of the historiography has got to be the contemporaneous documents.
So I have a super chat here that's related to this. This is from Teja. He says, can you say something about Karl Otto Koch, once commandant of Majdanek, who was executed by the SS for murder of 40 concentration camp inmates?
Oh, well, yeah, this is something that's going viral on Twitter right now. There's some MMA meathead. I don't know his name because I don't follow that scene, but he's got a large number of followers. This MMA meathead is saying, well, how can it be that the SS would prosecute Koch when, if it's supposed to be an extermination camp? Okay, this is where deniers completely separate from legitimate historiography. The Nazis had a network of camps in the western part of the theater of war, so in Germany and France, occupied France.
Yeah.
They had camps in the east. They had camps in Poland. They had camps and ghettos in occupied Russia. Every camp had a slightly different, or sometimes major different nature. Some camps were just for women. Some camps were labor camps. Some camps were extermination camps. Buchenwald, which is where Koch and his wife, where their infamy comes from, Buchenwald was not per se a Jewish camp at all. It was primarily a camp for political prisoners, communists especially, and it was a labor camp. If you were running a labor camp, you were not supposed to kill the labor. If you're running an extermination camp, that's what your order is. Now, Conrad Morgan, the SS judge, who prosecuted SS guys who were breaking the rules. Conrad Morgan prosecuted the Kochas because they were stealing, they were embezzling, and they were killing inmates who had information that could be valuable to Conrad Morgan's investigation. Funny enough, Conrad Morgan wanted to investigate Treblinka. Here was Conrad Morgan. He had investigated Auschwitz. He had investigated Buchenwald. His job in the SS was to root out corrupt commandants and corrupt personnel at these camps. And he had heard rumors about weird things going on at Treblinka. He tried to investigate, and he was barred from that. He was told, no, 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 hands off this camp. You don't get in there. You might have access to all the other camps, but this one's highly top secret. Morgan found that extremely weird from his point of view. Why is this one camp being shielded from me when I can investigate all the other camps? There were many cases where Conrad Morgan brought charges against SS guys who were embezzling or who had mistresses, because you weren't allowed to do that. You couldn't take the inmates as mistresses, and you couldn't steal the seized goods, and you certainly couldn't kill people if you were running a camp that was not for killing. If you're running
Majdanek is not clean. Like the official story of Majdanek, this was in, where was this again? Poland?
Yeah, Lublin in Poland.
Okay, so officially, what is claimed about this camp? Do they claim that it was an extermination camp or no?
Majdanek has scaled back its claims over the years. Initially, and this is part of what I did rather successfully in the early 90s, initially, Majdanek was being shown off as a camp that had like 5 different gas chambers, and it was an extermination camp. The historiography has gotten better there over the decades. It is very likely, based on documents, that there were shootings there at Majdanek. That there was a period, and I do want to go into this real quick. I won't take a lot of time with this, but in a weird way, the Nazis did their genocide a little backwards. They wanted to preserve the laboring Jews. They tended to kill the old and the young, like the kids and the elderly and the sickly. By like late 43, they were left with a Jewish population of laborers who were healthy, but had lost their kids in some cases, their parents in some cases. There were some attempted revolts that were put down quite violently. Even when, so my point being, even when the official policy of extermination ended, the Jewish population began revolting, especially once they were hearing word that Soviets were making advances and that the Nazis were losing. There's credible, very credible evidence of mass shootings at Majdanek. That's not to classify it as an extermination camp, because that was not its purpose. But okay, you did have times when mass killings did happen because of other reasons, like an attempted revolt.
So initially, there were some outrageous numbers about that camp, 1.5 million dead. That's been scaled all the way down to like 60,000, somewhere around there.
Yeah, and again, this is what historians do. That this is why people can't use the scaling down and the revision. They can't use it, or they shouldn't use it to say, well, now I don't believe anything. The historiography is working as it should. As the decades go on, people get a better grasp of these things, and so
that camp clearly was not, it couldn't have been an extermination camp if they were prosecuting the guards for killing members. No, that doesn't mean nobody died there. Obviously, some people did. But
Majdanek was primarily a labor pool. It was kind of like a depot for labor, a kind of central depot where Jews were sent, and then in most cases sent elsewhere for labor. But again, that doesn't mean that there weren't killings there. But when you look at a camp like Buchenwald, where the Kochas were, Buchenwald was purely a labor camp, and as purely a labor camp, it was not a place where the commandant was allowed to do that kind of stuff, killing people for his own private reasons and stealing stuff that was supposed to go to the Reich. None of this is a contradiction. And so when people say, well, why would they do this at
Hmm.
this camp and not that at another. It's kind of like saying, uh, in America, we have the supermax prisons where people are not let out of their room more than like 1 hour a week, and then you have like you have like honor ranch prisons, minimum security prisons, where inmates can go on a work furlough and ride horses. So the idea, what these deniers will do, is they'll take an example of an honor ranch prison where inmates could have a certain amount of freedom, and they say, well, look at this camp. If this camp exists, obviously nothing worse could exist, and that's just untrue. You have the same way we have different levels of severity in our
I
prisons.
mean, you guess you could just argue that it was compartmentalized and not everybody knew about the plans, and maybe these judges didn't know about the plans in the East, and so they were just doing basically what they thought was their job, something like that.
Well,
Because I don't think that
again,
everybody knew about it. It's not like every judge in the Reich like knew about all of the plans and all of the stuff goings on in the East and so on.
well, that's a point with Conrad Morgan, the SS judge. He was not told about Treblinka. He was simply told, hands off,
Right.
stay away from there.
Okay. So Treblinka, I wanted to ask you because some of the claims there from the revisionists is that the official story is that there 800,000 people were killed there, and that they were just all burned in open pyres, and there was no furnaces. So this is where people kind of get confused about this, because they believe that you can't just burn bodies, that many bodies, that quickly without furnaces, and just dispose of them totally. And Eric Hunt in his documentary goes over like how there was no real uh, there was no attempts to excavate the soil, or there was no serious disturbances to the soil, and that some like British historian went there and was trying to like dig around, and she only found a couple little trinkets here and there. She didn't find any mass graves. So what is the explanation of the lack of like disturbances in the ground if they were all burned and dumped there?
Well, first of all, the disturbances in the ground are simply proven by on the ground photos. We know for a fact that in the closing months of Treblinka's existence, everything was excavated. We have photos, on the ground photos of giant excavators digging that land up, and we have aerial photographs taken by the Allies of Treblinka going through that change, where the foundations buildings are erased and where things are dug up and replanted. Then we also have immediate post-war photos. The Poles went in there and they started digging around, and they wanted to dig stuff up. So we have photos of the Poles and Soviets after the war digging that ground up as well. The ground is not undisturbed. And again, there's plenty of photographs to prove that the ground is not undisturbed. However, the question does come down to this, is what deniers will end up. It's really their last bastion of hope, is to say that you can't burn. It wasn't quite 800,000, let's say 780,000. They say you can't burn 780,000 human bodies in a year and a half. And that's really what they will always go to in the end.
Out in the open as well, like
Yes,
they're
in
claiming
an
that
open
it's
pyre. Uh,
yeah.
that's what they will always run to when you hit them on everything else, when you hit them on documents, when you hit them on the lack of any alternate theory, but they'll always go down to that. And the fact is, again, this is stuff that really is a cursory search can turn up multiple reasons why the deniers are wrong. For example, in India, uh, roughly 8 million bodies a year are burned on open pyres in the most primitive way. And they're burned one at a time because each body, it's a religious ceremony. Cremation on open pyre is a sacred thing in Hinduism. So each body is burned individually, and they have to say their chants, and then they have to stamp down remaining bone fragments after the open pyre cremation. So you have
So yeah,
8 million
that
bodies a year, open pyre burned in India. But more than that, Brandon, you can also look to the 2001 foot and mouth disease epidemic in the UK, when the British decided they had to cull their entire herd of cattle and sheep and pigs. Roughly 4 to 5 million cattle, sheep, and pig carcasses were open air burned in the space of just a couple of months. We're not even talking about a year and a half. We're talking about a couple of months. Open air pyre burning absolutely works. Yes, you need an accelerant. An accelerant helps. The same as if you're barbecuing a steak. But it
Hmm.
absolutely works better than a cremation oven, better than a retort, because a retort in a crematorium can handle one, maybe two bodies at a time. Open air cremation can go on forever. There are parts of India, holy parts, sacred parts where bodies are burned, where the pyres never go out, and where just one body after the other thrown on the fire. So of
So
course,
that
there's no
would that be? Would you be able to corroborate all of that with like fuel shipments? So they would have had to have had a ton of fuel to be able to have burned. I guess they used fuel to light it or gasoline. Like what was the accelerant?
well, yeah, the bodies, of course, once you get them going, and again, this is the same as a. I hate to make such a base correlation, but it really is the same as a barbecue. You don't keep pouring lighter fluid on the coals. You just kind of use it as initially to get things going. But human bodies do burn. They absolutely do burn.
But if it
And
was fuel, there would have been some large shipments of fuel to Treblinka. Is there documentation for that?
Treblinka, and this is one of the problems we face because Treblinka was very obviously, I mean, we have documents about this. Treblinka and the Reinhardt camps were a top secret operation. That entire period of Jew killing, of extermination, was not only top secret, but we have documents that explicitly talk about how certain information will be conveyed orally only and not in writing. So a lot of what we have to figure about Treblinka, we kind of have to guess at. Now that's the fault of the Victoria's allies. The allies bungled the investigation. I wish that better people with, as I said, Nuremberg was still part of the war. They bungled a lot of that investigation, but then they even bungled it afterwards when some of the Treblinka commandants would be interviewed, the ones who survived. One Treblinka commandant survived into the 1990s. They were never asked the right questions. These are the questions that matter. We have lost the ability to find some of these details due to the bungled investigation and investigators who simply were not interested in asking the right questions. A woman like Hannah Arendt was only interested in asking philosophical questions. What does this mean about the nature of man and the nature of evil? Well, screw that.
So
Ask
so as
about the
far
fuel, ask about the other things. But
yeah, so the
the,
documents, like if they had, because your case is built around the documents, the diaries, and the statements.
mhm.
So what what is the documentary evidence around those Reinhardt camps? Is there evidence of shipments of fuel? Is there evidence around the supposed killing methods? Like what are the documents showing there? Because I haven't seen them.
Those specifics died with the commandants and died with the Nazis who would have done it. These are things that we would have wanted to know. What we do know, and here's the only way we can look at it, we have the documents that say Jews were killed there. We have that.
What's that? What's that document?
Well, the ones I just talked about like a half hour ago from Goebbels' diary. When Goebbels' diary talks about the Gauleiter of Vienna, he's talking about Odilo Globoknik, the head of Reinhardt. We have Goebbels' diary, we
Yeah.
have Himmler's speeches, we have the Core report, we have Stroop, we have Kuba and his various back and forth in Belarus.
And where does
Um,
the 800,000 number come from?
well, two sources. One is the Core report, the statistician report, and the other is something called the Höfle document, the Höfle message. That's something that Irving has made quite a bit about. And it's just a confirmation of those numbers. And the numbers also jibe with the numbers of Jews who were siphoned out of the ghettos. So what we have we have the confirmation that Jews were killed there. We don't have a lot of the specific documents, not just about fuel transports, but also about disposal of ashes. We can say to ourselves, it's very likely that the ashes were taken to the Bug River. But a lot of this stuff, these were things the commandants handled without committing it to paper because it was a top secret operation. Now, the deniers, their only way to contradict all of the documents about Jews being killed there, even though we do lack some of the specifics, the deniers' only way to contradict that is to provide one thing, one simple thing, showing that these 2.4 million Jews were resettled somewhere. And you would think that after, at least in my time in the field, so let's say 34 years, 35 years of people like Rudolph, Matonio, Forison, them looking, you would think they'd find one thing, but that is the problem. There's not a single piece of evidence, not one, that these 2.4 million Jews were resettled someplace.
What does Jürgen Graf say about this? Because I know he wrote a report where he was kind of trying to refute David Irving, who made these claims that they were killed in the Reinhardt camps. I have read that. I have to go back and reread. It's quite short. It's almost like less than 100 pages. Do you know what his explanation is there, Jürgen Graf?
Well, same as Matonio, same as Carlo Matonio. They say the Jews were resettled, and yet they don't have proof of it. Now you can go there. There's a page on Kodo.com. That is one of the main denier sites. For a while, Germar Rudolph was running it. I don't know the current state of it. I don't know who's running it now. But their conclusion is that they admit they have no evidence. In other words, that they haven't tried to fake anything. There's nothing that I liken it to. If someone were to say to me, "Can you refute my claim that the Titanic sank because of a meteorite?" And I would say, well, give me something to address. Give me a document, give me a claim, give me something that I can judge the truth or falsity of. But you can't, because it's just you saying, well, I think it was taken down by a meteorite. No, I don't have a document. I don't have any eyewitness statement. I don't have anything. Oh, but it was a meteorite. Well, it's the same thing with the Jews being resettled. The deniers don't have anything to show. They have a claim that they make, but it's not based on anything, which means it gives me nothing to refute. If they were to present a document from any side, from Jews, from Nazis, from Soviets, from Soviet spies, from Western Allied spies,
they don't have
anything.
The explanation for that. Okay.
In the absence of a single piece of anything claiming that Jews were resettled, putting that against the word of Goebbels, Himmler, Kohler, Stroop, and Kuba and Losa, you've got to give me something if you're going to try to refute the extermination theory. And Matonio and Graf don't have anything. All they have is hunches, but it's the same thing as the Titanic meteorite. Your hunch is not something I can refute. You've got to give me something that I can refute.
So that's the weak point of the revisionist side, is they don't have an explanation of where they were sent. If they acknowledge that they were sent east to those camps, but they don't have the evidence. And that's what Eric Hunt was saying when he wrote his recant paper, that he doesn't know where they went if they were sent further than those camps. Now,
let me just interrupt you. Keep in mind, Brandon, that in 1942 and early 43, when all of this would have been happening, the Eastern Front was probably the most densely packed area on Earth in terms of two giant warring armies, and all the civilians on both sides of the front, and all of the spies representing every party on Earth was there. So you had one of the most densely packed and one of the most watched and monitored parts of planet Earth at that time. So moving 2.4 million people to that part of the Earth and not a soul seeing it even with all the many dueling motivations going on there, and all the people from dumb peasants who don't know what they're supposed to notice or not notice, to professional spies, to as I said, to the greatest armies on earth, and nobody sees anything. That's continually going to cripple the denier argument. And they have been looking, and they've been looking, and they've pretty much admitted that they just can't find anything. And the reason they can't find anything, in my opinion, is because the Jews were killed, and they were not sent there to be.
So the best, I mean, I guess the best evidence that that they've come up with Treblinka specifically, because they don't really, I guess there's a few books on Belzec and stuff, but very few people know about those ones. But Treblinka, you can actually go there. Hunt went there. He filmed. He said that there's like a bakery. There's different facilities there. So it wasn't a pure, like the other camps, you can't just say it's a pure extermination center, because some Jews did testify that they went to Treblinka and left. So it couldn't have been a pure.
We covered that already, Brandon, and it's already, we're at 90 minutes, so I don't actually, we're at an hour. 50.
Yeah, I wanted to get back to this one.
Just to answer your question, Treblinka had facilities because it had a permanent staff of Nazis and Nazi-affiliated guards of other nationalities who had been recruited, and a permanent skeleton crew of
many
Jews
in the movement.
Okay. So of course there was a kitchen. Of course there were bathrooms, because you had hundreds of people living there who had to eat and they had to poop. So of course that was there.
So then that is not necessarily a great argument. So this clip here, I just want to show this clip. I don't know how much more time you have, but this clip here is a guy talking about Loiter. Mm-hmm. And he's the guy that did the Loiter report that's kind of used as proof that that they couldn't have used Zyklon B because there wasn't enough cyanide residue, right? This is the main. But he's actually showing a clip here of Germar Rudolph, who's one of the main revisionists from Germany, himself saying he doesn't buy into the Loiter report. He says it's not accurate.
Don't want to say anything against their sacred cow, with some even going as far as to promote ideas and theories which they know to be incorrect just to save face. Now, this is the story how the ragtag remnants of this revisionist movement is eating itself. The drama within the Holocaust denying movement was first exposed when German chemist and convicted Holocaust denier Germar Rudolph discussed some of the many issues he had with the Loiter report on Jim's internet show.
It startled me a number of times that certain claims in there were evidently wrong or untenable from a technical point of view. And some of them made me just doubt whether this is really true or not. And I bring up 2 points here. The first one is the explosive nature of hydrogen cyanide. Hydrogen cyanide is extremely explosive, within a range of 6 to 41%, I think, in air, as I could remember it. However, usually the amount of hydrogen cyanide, or the concentration of cyanide used for disinfestation, is way below that limit. And so I was doubtful about the general claim by Leuchter in his report that it is so explosive that the whole thing would have blown up.
Right. Here, Gemma is referring to a claim made by Fred in various interviews and in the Loiter report that hydrogen cyanide, the active ingredient in the pesticide Zyklon B, which was used in the homicidal gas chambers, is explosive at the concentrations used to kill people. Now, this is simply just incorrect, because the lower explosion limit for hydrogen cyanide is 56,000 parts per million. American chemist Richard Green predicted that the victims in the gas chambers were exposed to as little as 450 to 1,810 parts per million, far above the lethal threshold and an order of magnitude lower than the lower explosion limit. These irrefutable facts have not deterred Fred, who still to this day pushes this self-defeating, illogical argument to the embarrassment of his fellow revisionists. After all, this pesticide, when it's used properly to kill pests, is used in a much higher concentration than when it was used to kill people in the homicidal gas chambers. Who in their right mind would make an explosive pesticide to be used in day-to-day use? No one.
And Fred's part of this confusion because I'm talking to him and he's telling me things that I don't even agree with. You know, I said, no, Fred, that's not true because I've read your stuff. I've read your information and I've read that book and I'm coming out with different information here. And I don't think he has read it. And I think, like you say, I think what's happened with Fred, he's living in the past. He's not updating his information to get it out to people in a correct way. So when he gets interviewed on not TV programs, but you know, other internet programs like we're doing here, he's telling people the same stuff. And that's why I'm concerned.
And remember, when it comes to gas execution,
so I guess like most of the actual even revisionists don't use his stuff anymore, do they?
No, and I never did. I mean, I've known Fred Lutcher personally since 1992, and I never used his work because I never had a single bit of confidence in him as a professional or as someone who knew what he was talking about. So Germar Rudolph far surpassed him in terms of being a chemist and having knowledge of those matters. Lutcher was always an amateur. That clip you just showed, that guy who was interviewing Germar Rudolph, this Rizzoli fellow, is very funny, maybe not to the people involved, certainly to me. Rizzoli just recently, like his best friend got cleaned out by Fred Lutcher, and Rizzoli's been doing all these videos about how Fred Lutcher's no good because Lutcher stole all this money, and I'm just bringing that up. I mean, it's public knowledge. This is nothing that I'm saying that. I mean, Rizzoli's done videos about this. So I'm just saying what is already known. But this is another thing that makes deniers laughable, because up until Rizzoli's friends got scammed by Fred Lutcher for like 20 grand, Rizzoli was like, oh, Fred Lutcher, he's the best. He's the smartest guy in the world. And then he gets scammed by Lutcher, and he's like, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's living in the past. A lot of times these guys make up their minds about truth based on their own personal, do I like this guy or do I not like this guy? I had that happen to me, where people will come to me and say, Dave, you're the smartest revisionist in the world, and then I'll say something they don't like, and they'll be like, damn you, the Mossad paid you off. You're paid off by the Mossad. That's not how you determine the truth or untruth of something. But yes, getting back to Lutcher, he was never reliable. He was always a charlatan. And as I said, I've known him personally for a long time, and I never used his work. And you can even see, as a part of the Montel Williams show I did, where this Jewish fellow from a museum who I'm debating is like, I'm paraphrasing because I'm going by memory, but he's like, I notice you're not mentioning Lutcher, and I'm like, yeah, and I absolutely on purpose not.
So he took samples from the Birkenau alleged
He took samples from all the rooms. He took samples from the main camp gas chamber at the Stammlager, the main camp, and then he took samples from the two dynamited rooms at Birkenau. But one of Lutcher's mistakes, and you see this in the video, he himself shot because he had a camera person with him who shot him taking the sample. He just goes in there like a chimpanzee and starts banging on walls with a hammer. He's mixing the top layer of the concrete. These tests are very delicate, and he's mixing the top layer with the drywall and the other things beneath the top layer. So he's just pounding away with these tools, creating bags of dirt, bags of detritus, bags of gravel, and then taking those to be analyzed. If you're going to do a proper wall surface analysis, you have to very delicately analyze the surface and not smash it with a hammer so that those samples get mixed in with what's
have they done a different test and had different results, or what?
Oh yeah, Germar Rudolph did, but so did the Auschwitz State Museum, so did the Krakow Forensic Institute, and everyone's kind of more or less on the same page. I don't want to speak for Germar, and Germar is a guy I've known since '94, and I disagree with him, but I also feel like he's just been so wronged by the prosecutions against him. So I never like to speak ill of him. So I don't want to paraphrase him, but generally the understanding is all of these walls had some level of residue. It could have come from delousing, but it also could have come from small-scale gassings, and that's one of the reasons I say that we can't prove a negative, that we can't say it never happened.
Right. I mean, I guess the claim is that they did delouse other rooms as well. They did spray it on just to disinfect the buildings themselves,
Sure.
which could be
Yeah.
from that.
And that's one of the reasons that both Lucher and Farzan are incorrect, because they would make all these claims about you can't use Zyklon in this room or in this with this light fixture. Of course you could. All the rooms were deloused. Zyklon was used all over the camp, and because that's what it was designed for. It was designed to be used in rooms.
So I guess the one main there's a guy called Denier Bud. Have you heard of him?
Well, I mean, I don't know him personally, but I know the videos he's done certainly.
His whole thing is the mathematical equations that he says, you know, the rooms were this size, they were quite small, and they would have had to gas this number of people, and they had to drag them up this elevator 15 at a time and then cremate 2 hours. So he does this mathematical equation saying it would have taken way too much time to be able to kill that many people in that room. What's the response to that?
Well, here we're talking about Auschwitz, Birkenau specifically, and I do believe that the figure that they give these days for Auschwitz-Birkenau, well, the figure of Auschwitz entirely is like 1.1 million, the majority of that being murdered Jews. I do feel that's too high. I think it's much too high, the same way that I feel that the overall figure of murdered Jews in the Holocaust is too high. The 6 million figure is simply untenable, my own personal figure, and this is as close as you can get because we don't have a lot of records for the final year of the war. But my own personal figure could not be less than 3 million and very unlikely to be more than 3.5. So, I mean, that makes me, in a lot of people's eyes, that makes me a denier because I'm saying the 6 million figure is too high.
Well,
but it is.
The 6 million figure, it's bandied around. There's some kind of religious, you see here that they've been saying this since like the 1800s, and they said it in World War I, and they're saying 6 million. Before the war is even over, they're saying it's 6 million. So there's some kind of Jewish religious connection to the 6 million number, right? That has to be the case.
Well, there are other reasons, though, Brandon, and this is, I was just talking about this with a guy on Twitter the other day. There's a few reasons. Number one is 6 million at the turn of the 20th century. It was believed that 6 million was the number of Jews in Russia. And 6 million was often used as a kind of shorthand for saying the Jews of Russia. It was also believed that there were 12 million Jews in all of Europe. Now, that was incorrect. There's about 10 million in all of Europe, but it was generally believed that there were 12. And so 6 million was often a shorthand for saying half the Jews of Europe. And then there's also the factor you have to keep in mind, Brandon, when you have so many deniers put these memes on Twitter that show all the uses of 6 million. You have to remember,
right? Like this one here, it says 6 million exterminated. This is talking about Russia here.
But yeah, exactly. These were not just shorthands that were used, but also when you go back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, most newspapers relied on wire service reports. So stuff was copied the same way today. Reuters and the AP release a wire service report and it ends up in 500 or 1,000 other newspapers or websites. A lot of this repetition is simply due to the fact that the Jewish telegraph agency or a wire service would release a report and it just gets copied because a newspaper in Chicago was unlikely to have a Berlin bureau or a Moscow bureau or a Paris bureau, so they relied heavily on wire.
They insisted on this 6 million, like from the very outset. Like I think it was in January 1945. Ilya Ehrenberg, who is the Jewish communist in Russia, Stalin's propagandist, he comes out with 6 million, and then that gets repeated and repeated, and they insist on that 6 million number. But as you said, it's not 6 million. Officially, it can't be 6 million. So why do they insist on 6 million?
Well, first of all, I want to stress that going back to my point about everything in the immediate post-war is still the war. But when you get to 1953, when Gerald Reitlinger writes the first great Holocaust book, The Final Solution, Reitlinger puts the figure, he gives a low ball of 4.1 million. He says between 4.1 and 4.5. He says, so you can
But
look at
all
this
the
post-war.
newspapers still say 6 million today, all right?
Well, because eventually it got politicized, but it wasn't politicized in the 50s. Reitlinger was able to say 4.1 million, and he was fine. And the book became a bestseller. It wasn't until roughly 1978-79 that Jewish groups began really insisting on the 6 million thing. And in fact, Reitlinger got criticized for that book from 1953 for the lowball figure. But we can't go by when things are politicized, either in the immediate post-war years or later, when groups like the ADL begin throwing their weight around and demanding fealty to a particular number. That cannot affect
Right,
my
and what's so
judgment.
absurd about it is that you can go to jail in Europe for saying it's not 6 million, even though many historians say that it's not 6 million and it couldn't be. So that is and Jewish organizations are responsible for those Holocaust denial laws. And so they've created like this crazy situation where you to deny something that even mainstream historians don't believe can get you thrown in jail, which is insane.
Well, of course, that's 100% true, but it is a separate issue. Now, I'm a guy who 30 years ago was incredibly vocal, testifying for people who were being persecuted and prosecuted under these laws. These laws are horrific. These laws are an affront not just to human rights, but they are an affront to the process of accurate historiography. And a lot of mainstream Holocaust scholars like Deborah Lipstadt will give lip service to saying, "Oh, I don't think those laws are good," but they don't try to change them. They're sort of okay, those laws exist. Whereas I did my best in my day, especially in Canada, going to bat for Ernst Zundel again and again. I did my best to try to challenge those laws. Those laws are terrible, but we do have to separate the issue of the anti-free speech laws, which are abominable, inexcusable, and should be fought with every ounce of every conscientious person's body. We do have to separate that from the issue of, okay, but also my job is to try to establish the most accurate historiography.
Okay, so briefly, I think, you know, the truth often lies somewhere in the middle. I think that the people who say it's pure, you know, purely a hoax and there was 0 killings, I mean, that's obviously incorrect. There was definitely shootings and so forth. Not even Jews, like POWs and Ukrainians and Russians and so on. And civilians in many countries. So the pure denialists are wrong. But as you've said as well, the pure exterminationists also try to cherry pick everything to make them the most the most harrowing story that they could come up with, so that there's like no nuance to it at all, right? Say there's no labor, it's all just. So I think there's probably some flubbing on both sides here.
Well, of course there is. I mean, that's 100% true. And you can't pick sides. What you have to do, and I'm probably honestly the only guy doing it at the moment, is you do have to look for that middle ground, not because you're trying to be moderate on purpose. And this is something I've stressed in my column over the years. Moderation in terms of ethical debates can be a sin. Like if you're saying, well, maybe a little child molestation is okay, but not a lot. Okay, that's the wrong kind of moderation. But when you're talking about factual matters like the Holocaust, you are likely to find that both extremes are wrong, and the truth really does lie somewhere in the middle. And I am probably the only one still fighting that very unpopular fight where I'm too much of a revisionist for the mainstream, and I'm not enough of a denier for the deniers.
That's something I've noticed as well. It's like the pure deniers they'll always disqualify you if you're not denying it enough, right? If you acknowledge that there's any atrocity whatsoever. And like I've done this recently where I'm pointing out like Hitler's anti-Slavic policies, which gets underplayed a lot. Not a lot of people
Right.
talk about it, but Hitler hated the Slavic people. And as someone who's pro-European and pro-Western, I'm pointing out to these people that he wasn't this like white savior that people make him out to be. He actually mostly did damage against other white people, especially Slavs, who he wanted to colonize for Lebensraum. So just pointing that out to them sends them crazy, because they want us to believe in the black and white narrative that he's either good or pure evil, when the truth is more complicated than that, right? It's not black and white.
Very true, Brandon. And I think that's a really good note, since we've now gone to like 2 hours and 10 minutes. I probably do have to go get about my day. It's been a great pleasure.
All right.
And I think this is a good note for us to end on.
I appreciate you coming on, and maybe we can speak in the future about some of these details. It's such a huge topic, you can't cover it in 2 hours, right? It's
well, you
enormous.
know, if you want, the next time I come on, accumulate some questions from your listeners. I'm more than happy to take on the questions that other people have. So if you want, in the the next month or so, accumulate some questions, and next time I come on, I'll deal with them.
Okay, sounds good. You did answer. There was one question that says, "What's the actual death toll?" from John Garatis. You answered that, and then the last one was about 150,000 Jews served in the Nazi army. Someone says, "Is that even true? Is that there's a book about that?" I don't think is that accurate?
Well, the Nazis had, when it came to German and Austrian Jews, the Nazis had a much more forgiving policy about mixed race Jews. You could have a partial Jewish heritage, and you could still be fine in society. You would not be restricted by a lot of the laws that apply to full-blooded Jews. And also, when you get to Polish Jews and Russian Jews, there was no out for them. But for German and Austrian Jews, there were a lot of what they call Mischling, a lot of mixed race Jews, a lot of Jews in mixed marriages, a lot of Jews who had converted. Yeah, they survived the war, and that was part of the again, this difference between the way the Nazis treated different populations of Jews.
They actually did the same thing with Slavs, where they said that generally they were against intermixing with Slavs, but then they made these exceptions for like the ones that they believe were of better blood or Germanic blood, and so they would kind of kidnap their children. Anyway, thanks, David, for coming on. I appreciate you. You do have a ton of knowledge on this subject, which is why I wanted to get you on, because you are an expert in this. You've been studying this for like 30 years. There's very few people that have that level of knowledge and knowing both sides of the argument too, right? Because most people are just stuck in one of the sides and they don't look at the other side.
It has been a very enjoyable interview. I'll be more than happy to do it again. And like I said, just get some questions from people, and I'll be very happy to address them.
All right, appreciate it. Have a good evening or afternoon. Afternoon, right?
Yeah, afternoon
okay, man.
Here. And you too.
Take care,
well.
man.
Yeah, take care. Bye-bye.
Oh. All right, there it is. Interesting stuff. So these are the newspaper clippings we were talking about, the 6 million number being bandied around.